you're an institution, from what I understand, of Jesuit inspiration. So one of the things we'll touch on is, in terms of the context of John Locke, will be some of the role of Jesuit thinking in the 16th and 17th century. In terms
May I interrupt you for 1 second? I'm going to switch you to the classroom or system in a minute, but before that, I still want to say, because I have to mute myself during that, I have to say to people watching from home or people being online, to post their questions to you in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, of the Zoom screen. You find that double text balloon Q&A. You can post your questions for Professor Rosenthal over there, and after the lecture we will return to these questions and you can deal with them. But now we will be listening to your lecture, and sorry for having interrupted.
No problem at all. No.
Interesting things about the Jesuit. I'm going to mute myself and now make yourself audible through the classroom system. Okay, go.
Okay, so John Locke in context. So what I will do in this lecture, John Locke is conventionally called the father of liberalism, right? Which would be the set of ideas that became the creed of the American founding in the 18th century. And it emerged in the 20th century as the basis of what we call today the global liberal order, or the liberal international system. So it's clearly one of the most influential frameworks of political thought. So as it says in the slide, my aim in this lecture, given particularly, among other things, time constraints, is not apologetic. That is, I'm not endeavoring to vindicate Lockean liberalism against challengers, but rather to clarify the key ideas of Lockean liberalism, and particularly to explain their emergence with reference to European intellectual history. So the way that I have structured the lecture, so first I'm going to make a few brief remarks about our age, the age of liberalism. Secondly, try to address the question, what is Lockean liberalism? Third, discuss the rise of notions of individual rights and the social contract in the 16th and 17th centuries, which constituted the context in which Locke was writing. And then the more immediate British context, which would be Locke as a response to Robert Filmer and his critique of Jesuit constitutionalism. So that's basically how I plan to structure the lecture. Okay, so just this is, I'm sure, very familiar to you, but we can call our era the era of liberalism. The 20th century was an era of ideological conflict, right? World War I largely brought an end to the traditional European monarchies in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and so forth. But then you have an era of ideological conflicts between liberalism, then fascism and Nazism, which were defeated in World War II. And then you have the long Cold War between, we could say, the liberal superpower, the United States, and the Marxist superpower, the Soviet Union. That conflict ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall. There you see the Brandenburg Gate in 1989, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and we now have a current paradigm, which I would say is built on three pillars, the current liberal world order. One is the premise of American unipolarity, that is, America as the liberal power, and even specifically Lockean liberal power, emerged from the Cold War as the unipole. Secondly, the globalization paradigm, right? Now that after 1989, the idea was that liberalism had become the only viable model, and you had an increasing move toward more porous borders, freer movement of goods, capital, persons. And I think we see also, though we won't get into him, right, the idea of global economic interdependence potentially replacing conflict, which had been a dream of liberalism since at least Kant. We also have the institutionalization of the liberal order through the formation of the Treaty of Maastricht, which led to the formation of the European Union in 1991, and the World Trade Organization in 1995. Now, what we saw during that period was a good deal of liberal triumphalism. So perhaps most famously, Francis Fukuyama, in his article, The End of History, wrote of the triumph of the West, of the Western idea is evident, first of all, in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. One thing I think that's interesting in his phrasing is that liberalism is not just a Western idea there, but the Western idea, right? So he says the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government, right? So we have this era in which it seems as though liberalism, it seemed to many observers as though liberalism had emerged as the definitive, if not the, and even the final form of political ideology. Now, if we turn to the 21st century, we see in academic life, even in America, questioning of the foundations of liberalism. For example, Richard Delgado, one of the founders of critical race theory, and this is both on the left and on the right. So he writes, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment, rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. And then, as it were, on the other side, Adrian Vermeule of Harvard University wrote that progressive liberalism has its own cruel sacraments. He speaks of it's the festival of reasoning, the ever-repeated overcoming of the darkness of reaction. And he writes that liberalism of the purportedly tolerant kind is to militant progressivism as the chrysalis is to the hideous insect. So the basic point is that liberalism is at the core of the debates which are going on today. If we look at the global stage, we see a number of forces which pose potential challenges to the liberal order, such that its future is at this point uncertain. There's the rise of China, threatening the looming end of American unipolarity, a resurgent Russia, the rise of neo-nationalism in the West, challenging elements of the globalization paradigm, and in some cases, critiquing liberalism per se. So the basic point is that liberalism is the core idea of our time, central to all the debates of our time. So if we want to understand our age, it makes sense to turn to its historical foundations and its founder, John Locke. So the next question that I want to look at is, what is Lockean liberalism, right? What do we mean when we speak of Lockean liberalism? So I would understand it as a set of answers to perennial questions of political philosophy. These include, these three I think are the most important. What is the origin of politics, right? How did politics arise, right? The political order. Second, what is the basis of political obligation? That is to say, why should we obey? And third is, what is the end or purpose of politics, right? What is government, as it were, for? What is its purpose? So I think one of the things that could help us illuminate this is to look at other answers to these three questions that have existed historically in the Western tradition. So if we compare Locke with Aristotle, right, classical political philosophy, we see a completely different set of answers to these questions. So Aristotle famously says that man is by nature a political animal, right? Meaning that there was no pre-political condition. Humans are always political. Now, what he primarily means by that is that human beings are by nature communal, right? And therefore, he links speech as a proof that human beings, right, are meant for each other, right? Meant to live in community. And in that sense, There is no sort of atomic individualism in the classical worldview, we could say. Secondly, what is the origin of political obligation? Why should we obey? Well, Aristotle argues that he says that authority and subordination are conditions not only inevitable, but also expedient. In some cases, things are marked out from the moment of birth to rule or to be ruled. In other words, within nature, there are natural hierarchies, right? And because there was always human beings always lived in political conditions, they were always rulers and ruled. And therefore, nature is ultimately the foundation for why some rule and others obey, right? That, in other words, the hierarchies of nature. And the third is, what is the end of politics, right? So Aristotle says that political fellowship must therefore be deemed to exist for the sake of noble actions, right? The object of the state, that is the polis, is the good life. So human excellence, human virtue is the reason why politics exists. Now, if we look at Locke, right, we see a set of completely different answers, right? So the first thing is that he argues that there is a time before politics, right? To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state of men, what state all men are naturally in. That is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they see fit, right? There was a time before government where humans did not have to obey, according to Locke, right? Additionally, it was calls it a state also of equality, since there's no political rulers and ruled, all are in the state of nature equal, right? Now, there are, as Locke will argue, inconveniences in the state of nature, but then the question is, how do we come into a political condition, right? What is it that justifies the right of some to rule others? And Locke's basic answer is consent, right? No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent, right? So everyone must consent to be ruled in order for that rule to be legitimate. And the third element is, what is the purpose of government? And so Locke will argue that he says clearly that it exists for the regulating and preserving of property, right? Now, important to understand, right? And he calls property being the end of government, right? So government does not exist to make people virtuous, right? Government exists to protect their rights as individuals, right? And that I would say would be fundamental to the classical liberal position that Locke sketches out. Now, Locke's theory of property is in some sense the core of his doctrine. First thing that's important to understand is that by property, Locke does not only mean money and physical possessions, right? Everyone has a property in themselves, right? So that, so he speaks of his property, that is his life, liberty, and estate, right? So property includes both our persons, our freedom, and our possessions. What is the basis of the right of property? Well, drawing on, among other things, the biblical idea of a grant of the world to mankind to tame and domesticate, right, and be stewards of, is the idea that human beings have a right to the things of the world, right? And he also argues from natural reason. But what's important, specific to Locke's theory, is the idea that labor, when we labor on the world, right? For example, you build a house from wood that you derive from nature, that becomes your property in the state of nature, right? So there is, as it were, a natural right of property that exists. And each person also, of course, has a right of property to themselves. Now, one of the things that's important to say is there are limitations, right? So it says no man can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and good left in common for others, right? So in other words, you don't have the right to take so much of the goods of the world that others are deprived of basic necessities, which is an idea you'll find also in people like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. But that's an important limitation. Now, what happens? Well, so in the 18th century, you have what we can call the liberal revolutions in America and the American colonies, the French Revolution. Basically, Lockean liberalism became the core of what we can call the American creed as it was expressed in the Declaration of Independence, right? So if we look at the Declaration of Independence, right, all of these early founders were thoroughly immersed in the writings of Locke, we see a number of contentions, right? Contentions which, although they're called self-evident, I don't think we could call them self-evident if we look at the long trajectory of history of political philosophy, but they're self-evident if you are a fervent Lockean, right? So first of all is the primacy of individual rights, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that a state is replaced with happiness there. Secondly, protection of rights is the proper end of government. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That consent is the origin of political obligation, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that there is a right of revolution where the state violates the social contract. So I think what you basically see there is that the creed, we could say, America was in a sense founded on the Lockean liberal creed as expressed in this founding document. Okay, now I want to look at turn to Locke's the broader European context of early modernity and the 16th and 17th century, and how these ideas arose, because Locke was not writing in a vacuum, right? Locke was part of a long debate and discussion on these questions. So that's what I kind of want to take a look at. Now, one thing that we should talk about is the Whig conception of history, right? There was an article just today in this blog, The Imaginative Conservatives, right, where Michael J. Connolly talks about a vision of how things happened historically. Progress represented the Protestant European principles of individualism and liberty, and by extension, the Whiggery and liberalism, which emerged to defended enemies of progress were Catholics and Tories, who perpetually formed obstruction and were, to use a common Whig liberal phrase, on the wrong side of history, right? So the Whig history is a progressive narrative where liberalism is in some sense, so the end of history, right? The final, the best, and then we can divide history into sort of the good guys and the bad guys, the forces of reaction that are resisting progress and the forces of progress that are going along with progress. Now, I'm going to want to take, that's a picture of Lord Macaulay, in case you're wondering. One of the figures associated with Whig history. Sorry?
May I interrupt you for a second, because I think the text is not always so clear. So okay, we should make an effort to go to the full presentation mode. So if you
how do I do this?
You see slideshow above on your PowerPoint screen.
What I'm seeing is mute, stop video, participants, chat, Q&A, new share.
You have to go out of the Zoom mode and go to your presentation, and then to the slideshow mode.
Okay. I hope so I can do this. Okay.
You can see on the top of your screen there, you see insert, roll, design, transitions, animations, and then slideshow.
How do I go to the Zoom mode from where I am, from what I'm looking at?
As you press escape and you go to the right screen on the bottom of your screen. You'll find the PowerPoint again. You are sharing now.
Okay, I'm looking.
You need to go to the PowerPoint you are now sharing and then go to slideshow.
I'm trying to get out of the. I'm just looking at my PowerPoint presentation. I don't see the.
So when you
Are you
press
not
escape,
not able to do it from the console, from your console? You're not able to.
if you send me your PowerPoint, I could, but I don't have your PowerPoint.
Oh,
That's the
okay,
problem.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to see. I don't see where that is. You are screen sharing. I just don't know what to press.
You are screen sharing, so you have to maybe stop sharing for a moment.
Okay.
Yes. And now you go to the PowerPoint you opened. You go
Yes.
in the PowerPoint, and there you start slideshow.
Oh,
Then
I
from
see what you mean. You didn't mean.
And then from current slide.
Okay, I got it.
And now you share again.
Okay, but now everything disappeared.
Oh, okay.
Can you
Take your
put me
time.
on? No, I mean, I see I'm looking at the PowerPoint, but I don't see I don't see any console.
And now you have to go at the bottom of your screen again to the Zoom webinar where you're in.
Right, so I have to get out of this.
No, you leave the PowerPoint open and you go to the Zoom environment again, and there you press share screen. Normally it's at the bottom of your screen that you find the Zoom icon, like a camera.
Right camera. Now, I just have the PowerPoint covering my whole screen, and I don't know how to get out of it.
Escape again.
Okay. Okay. So.
Now go to the bottom of your screen and then screen sharing, share PowerPoint.
Okay, screen sharing, share.
Yes.
And
yes,
now.
But it's not in full mode. No, it's still in the.
No. Okay, now what happens if I go into?
No, if you go with the mouse, the bottom of the. Oh yeah, you can't do this in Zoom, eh? Yeah, slideshow.
How about
then,
now?
Yes, that's better.
That do it?
Yes, that's better. From current slide, can you press that?
From current slide.
Yes. To the left, to the left. Still to
yes.
the left. One more, two more. Yes.
Yes, here.
Yes, yes. That's it.
Did that do it?
Yes, and now we continue. Great.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was just discussing about this conception of Whig history. The conception of Whig history as sort of a division between, let's say, the forces of progress and the forces of reaction, and will tell a more complex historical story, starting in an unlikely place, which actually was often cast as the villain in the Whig historical narrative. So let's turn to the idea of individual rights and the debates on individual rights, which occurred in the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, right? So what happens at that point, right? Spain conquers much of the New World with the conquistadors, and the Spanish Empire replaces the indigenous empires and civilizations of the New World, such as the Aztecs and the Incas, right? And this very quickly led to a debate about, largely among clerics at the time, right, about what were the rights of the people of the New World, right? So there was one figure, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued, drawing on Aristotle's idea of natural slaves, that because of certain practices such as human sacrifice and so forth, the peoples of the New World showed themselves to be natural slaves and therefore could be subjected, deprived of their liberty and their possessions by the Spanish authorities. But there was fierce opposition to this by, among others, the Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas, right? And it culminated in a great debate in Valladolid, revolving about the question of whether rights exist and whether rights are universal. Do they apply to all human beings, right? And so for our purposes, the most important figure to discuss to start this discussion would be Francisco de Vitoria. So basically, a crucial concept in all this is going to be this idea of dominion, right? So dominion, Vittoria describes as a moral power or faculty over something, right? He identifies dominion with the Latin term jus, which means right, right? So what does this mean? Well, so human beings have dominion over themselves and potentially over their possessions, right? Dominion is grounded in the capacity for rational self-mastery over one's own acts, right? Which he believes all human beings share, in the capacity for reason, and also in the biblical idea of all human beings as sharing in the image and likeness of God. So now I just should mention, I mean, that's on the screen, but I just should mention that Vittoria himself was drawing on a longer discussion about individual rights going back into the Middle Ages, which was discussed by a number of scholars. So what does Vittoria argue? So he argues that there's two kinds of natural right, dominium, right, over one's own body or person, dominium sui, and over one's own actions, dominium sui actus, right? There's also dominium over things, like that's the right to property, dominium rerum. And importantly, he distinguishes this concept of dominium from dominium civile, which is the right of property in civil law. So these rights are natural, grounded in nature. So how does Vittoria apply this to the question of the New World natives, right? He argues that these natives have an inherent right, a dominium over themselves, right? And here, so he says, dominium fundator in imagine Dei, right? The dominium is founded in the image of God, right? Said homo est imago Dei per naturam, right? The human beings are in the image of God by their nature. Skeletet per potentias rationalis, right? By way of their natural powers or potencies, right? So this is not something that can be lost. Rights are something fundamental in what human beings are. So what we should note is that Vittoria's anthropology of rights is a synthesis of both classical rationalism, the idea of human beings as the rational animal, and a biblical conception, human beings as being in the image of God. And therefore, he argues in this work, 1539 work, that the New World natives cannot be legitimately deprived of their power over themselves or of their property. Okay, now we'll turn to another political issue going on in Europe itself at this time, right, in the 16th century. So in the Middle Ages, the idea was that Europe was a Respublica Christiana, right? It was essentially a religious community under the spiritual rule of the Pope and the political rule of the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Although they were kings, they were relatively weak. There was also a very decentralized feudal system. So what's happening in the early modern period is that kings are centralizing their power, right? In Spain, in France, in England, and elsewhere, right? Subordinating the church and the feudal lords, and creating militaries, centralized civil administrations. Okay, so now we have the age of absolutism, right? The defense of the idea of the absolute rule of the king, which is an early modern idea more than it is a medieval idea. So Jean Baudin is turning to Roman law principles, right? These go back to Ulpian. The first is that law is nothing else but the command of the sovereign. In other words, law proceeds from the will of the king or the sovereign, right? The other one, princeps legibus solutus, is that the king is himself absolved of the law, or whoever is the sovereign. So we have a very clear defense using Roman law principles of the idea of the absolute state. Going together with this, we have this idea of patriarchalism. Patriarchalism is the idea that the king is in essence a father. And so the argument goes that the child is born under the natural authority of the father, right? Naturally subject to the authority of the father. So in the same way, everyone is born under the natural authority of the king as the father of the country or the people. So basically, it's an equation of royal and paternal authority, right? Although it's fair to say this idea doesn't have a lot of followers today, it's worthy to note that John Locke dedicated his first treatise on government entirely to the refutation of this connection between royal and paternal authority, which Filmer was going to defend. Oh, and there you see James, who was a not disinterested defender of the patriarchalist theory. Now you have a constitutionalist response, which comes particularly from two Jesuits, Francisco Suarez of Spain, who was also part of the school of Salamanca, and a famous Italian cardinal, somewhat infamous in some respects because of his involvement in Galileo, but nonetheless one of the most learned figures of the age, St. Robert Bellarmine. So what are the fundamental critiques of patriarchalism that we find in the school of Salamanca with Suarez? Okay, so the first thing is that political power and what he calls potestam oikonomicam, right, meaning the domestic power of the father, these two things are distinct, right? So that he says that Adam had domestic power as father of the family, but he didn't have political power to rule, right? So the second precept of Suarez is that there's no particular society is natural, right? So he agrees with Aristotle and the Thomistic tradition that society, human beings are naturally social beings, but politics, political authority is not natural. So that means that the human beings are born not into subjection to political authority, but rather in a condition of freedom and political equality, right? The third key premise is the idea that the original locus of sovereignty is the whole community, right? Is the community and not any particular individual like a king, right? So here's the key, here is where the idea of the social compact comes in, right? He says that there must be a pactum translationis by which the community freely delegates rule to the sovereign, right? By consent, necesse est ut consensus communitatis ille tribuatur, right? It must be freely given by the consent of the community. And that is the only legitimating condition for kings or other sovereigns to rule. And then we have Robert Bellarmine, who says that power is given by the multitude to one man or to more by the same law of nature. The commonwealth of itself cannot exercise this power. Therefore, it is bound to bestow it upon some one man or few. It depends upon the consent of the multitude to ordain for themselves a king. So again, the origins of political obligation lie in consent. So to summarize the Salamancan position, there's a concept of dominium, which is a specifically human capacity of free self-mastery over one's person and possessions, which gives a person a moral claim to them, right? Which, as I mentioned, is an idea rooted both in Greco-Roman rationalism as well as biblical conceptions. The society-state distinction, very important because this is a distinction which didn't really exist, for example, for Aristotle. Society is natural, right? Human beings are naturally social communal beings, but any particular political order is a human construction, right? And therefore, there's a state of nature, a pre-political condition. And so we need consent among these free and equal subjects in order to establish a government, which is the purpose of the pactum, the social contract, whereby power is delegated by the consent of the community. So I'm now going to turn to the Filmer-Locke debate, right? So Filmer's Patriarcha is written as a direct response to the Jesuit constitutionalism of Suarez and Bellarmine, right? So he wants to defend the tenets of patriarchalism and divine right monarchy, now in the context of England's conflicts over royal or parliamentary supremacy. So Locke's two treatises we can therefore contextualize as a response to the theses of Filmer. Okay, so basic English history, of course, we have the English Civil War, right, which is about two questions, right? For us, perhaps the most important is the question of who is in charge, right? Is it Parliament or is it the king? Can the king impose taxes, for example, without the consent of Parliament? And there's also the question of religion, right, between the Puritans and the Anglicans, right? This culminates in a civil war, the execution of King Charles, the establishment of a Puritan theocracy, we could say, under Oliver Cromwell. And Robert Filmer is writing as a zealous royalist, we could say. And his concern is that the contractarian theories of the Jesuits have the effect of undermining royal authority and encouraging sedition. So what Filmer will argue is that these are incorrect tenets, the idea that human beings are naturally endowed and born with freedom from all subjection. He says that the desire for liberty was the cause of the fall of Adam. And he says, upon the ground of this doctrine, both Jesuits and some other zealous favorers of the Geneva discipline have built a perilous conclusion that the people or multitude have power to punish or deprive the prince. In other words, he's arguing that the Jesuit theories that he wants to attack furnish the ground for subversion, for revolution, as England has seen. So Filmer will devote himself to attacking the contract theory. He argues that Adam had a complete economical power, but his power was also royal. And he says that let us condescend a while to the opinion of Bellarmine and Suarez and all those who place supreme power in the whole people, and ask them if their meaning be that there is but one and the same power in all the people of the earth, so that no power can be granted except that all the men upon the earth agree and meet to choose a governor, right? So throughout Filmer's treatise, you will see the critiques of Suarez and of Bellarmine. So the main contention of Patriarcha is this identification of royal and paternal authority. And again, the idea is just as as human beings are born naturally under subjection to their father, so they are born in a state of natural subjection to the king. There's a natural as well as divinely granted right. That right is inherited, right? In other words, there's a process of inheritance whereby both paternal and royal dominion are passed on from the first father of the human race, Adam, to the later kings. Okay, so basically we have the English Restoration, right? The Puritans fall from power. There's a restoration of the monarchy, first with Charles II. But very soon, the issue of religion arises because of Charles II's brother James is a Catholic, right? So there are efforts by the nascent Whigs to exclude Catholics from the throne of England, and the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was John Locke's patron, we could say, collaborator, was one of the Whigs, we could say, who was trying to pass the exclusion bills. The fear was a Catholic restoration in England, right? So because of the exclusion crisis, England divides between the Whigs, who favor the supremacy of Parliament, and the Tories, who favor royal supremacy. James II ascends the throne in 1685, the last Catholic king of England, but then there's a revolution of 1688 that puts in power Mary, the Protestant daughter of James, and her husband, King William of Holland. So Locke is writing the two treatises in this context, right? In a sense, defending the right to depose a king and establish another form of government, perhaps. But he's most directly attacking the tenets of Filmer as a defense of sort of a royalism. And it should be said, There were a number of Whig tracts at the time, some of them read by the American founders, including by Algernon Sidney and James Tyrrell. So Locke's treatises undertakes the refutation of the patriarchalist position. The first treatise is focused on biblical exegesis, right? Trying to show from the Bible that paternal and regal authority are distinct. The second treatise, which is much more widely read today, puts forth the alternative contractarian position as considered canonical text of the classical liberal theory. Now, there's a strategic thing Locke has to do, which is that he can't simply defend Suarez and Bellarmine because, well, the Whigs are trying to overthrow and replace the Catholic monarch, among other things, right? Defending the Jesuits wouldn't really suit his political purposes. But fortunately for Locke, there was another figure, Richard Hooker, who had almost the exact same set of propositions. He was, in a sense, an Anglican Thomist of the 16th century. And he can turn to him for backing, as it were, for sort of an authority to back him in, and portray his positions as sort of traditional, right? So he rejects Filmer's idea that men are not naturally free and wants to defend a consensualist position. So we see here, that's, by the way, is James II and his family. He says that these two powers, political and paternal, are perfectly distinct and separate, right? And he quotes Hooker, as you see, almost in nearly all his, in a great deal of his most central statements, he quotes Hooker to provide sort of a theological support from someone who is widely respected, right? So he wants to argue, of course, for parliamentary supremacy. So he says that the legislative is not only the supreme power of the Commonwealth, but sacred and unalterable in the hands where the community have once placed it. And he quotes Hooker saying that the lawful power of making laws to command whole politic societies of men belongeth properly unto the same entire society. In other words, that sovereignty is vested in the community, not in the person of the king, right, who only has power delegated to him by the community, but in the whole community. So here he turns to Hooker to argue that there is a pre-political condition, right? A pre-political condition in which the natural laws, the natural moral laws would still exist. But he says to those that say that there were never any men in the state of nature, I will not oppose the authority of the judicious Hooker, where he says the laws which have hitherto been mentioned, the laws of nature do bind man absolutely, right? But Hooker also said that all public regiment that is government seems to have risen from the quote, deliberate advice, consultation, and composition between men. In other words, government is a construct. It's not a natural institution like the family. It depends upon human agreement, right? He turns to Hooker also for the discussion of the inconveniences of the state of nature. They saw that to live by one man's will became the cause of all man's misery. That's a quote from Hooker. And so we have this idea, well, why should you leave the state of nature if it sounds so good, everyone is free and equal? Well, it's truthfully inconvenient to have to defend yourself all the time. And since no one is a just judge of their own cause, many problems arise when there's no government and there's no law. So there's very rational reasons for people to leave the state of nature. So he says, Locke says, the equality of men by nature, the judicious Hooker looks upon as so evident in itself, right? That is to say, in the state of nature, no one is a natural ruler over anyone else. All are equal. Okay. Now is this idea that the consent of the governed is the basis of political obligation, right? So he says, for without this, the law could not have had that which is absolutely necessary to its being a law, the consent of the society, right? And again, he quotes Hooker Laws they are not, therefore, which public approbation hath not made so. Ultimately, it is the consent of the governed which gives laws their legitimacy. And there we have also the basis of the social contract, right? Thus, every man, by consenting with others to make one body of politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and to be concluded by it, or else this original compact, whereby he with others incorporates into one society, would signify nothing and be no compact, right? So it's by the social contract that we delegate power to a sovereign, right? We could say, or to a government, which exists for the purpose of protecting the rights of the individuals who make up that society, life, liberty, and estate of the individuals. Okay, so what are the continuities of Locke's theory with Locke, Hooker, and the Salamancans, which we could say for our purposes are virtually indistinguishable? One is central to this kind of constitutionalist argument is the distinction of paternal and royal power, the existence of a pre-political but not pre-moral or pre-social state of nature, right? That is to say, politics is not natural. There's a pre-political state of nature. The whole community is understood as the original locus of sovereignty. There's a pactum translationis, right? A transferring compact that explains the community's delegation of power to the state. And there's an emphasis on consent and the social contract to explain political obligation. Now, I would not want to say, of course, that Locke was simply repeating what because if that were true, we couldn't call him the father of liberalism, right? So there are a number of elements that I think distinguish Locke from the 16th, early 17th century theories that I had been discussing, from the Salamancans, Bellarmine, Hooker. Okay, one would be an emphasis on religious toleration, right? From his 1689 letter on toleration to the Dutch theologian, Protestant theologian, Philip van Limburg, who you see below. This is an idea where I think we have to say Locke was, if not a complete pioneer, at least a very central figure. And I think this is still something we associate with liberalism, the idea of religious toleration, which we can put in the context of the religious wars in Europe during the 16th and 17th century, right? So Locke writes, the toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the genuine reason of mankind that it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as not to perceive the necessity and advantage of it in so clear a light. So the other element is the tendency to restrict the state's law to secular purposes, right? So during the medieval and early modern period, it was taken for granted that, for example, promoting religious orthodoxy was one of the functions of government. The king, whether Catholic or Protestant, received his authority from God in some sense. And there was an idea that religious orthodoxy was a concern of the state. With Locke, we see this idea of the Commonwealth existing to promote secular purposes, right? Procuring, preserving, and advancing their civil interests. And how does he define these? Life, liberty, health, and indolency of body, right? It's physical existence that the state is principally concerned with, not spiritual existence, right? Locke also places, I think, a greater emphasis on the individual and property rights. We could get in also into Locke's very complex and disputed natural law theory, but at all events, teleological element, that is the element in traditional natural law theories that focuses on purpose, is kind of removed, or at least attenuated, right? I'm not sure if removed is the right term, but at least attenuated from what you would see in the very Thomistic intellectualism of the Salamancans. And another aspect is Locke's clearly revolutionary intentions, at least if we think of this, the 1688 Whig revolution, which was a relatively moderate revolution compared to later revolutions, perhaps. It wasn't trying to create something radically new or break with the past, but nonetheless, there was a revolutionary element there. It's certainly not present in Hooker, and it's arguable whether it's present really in the Salamancans, although they were certainly concerned to limit monarchical power. So I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover tonight in the initial, at least in the initial discussion. So I look forward to any thoughts, questions, comments that you may have.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Rosenthal, for this lecture and this presentation on John Locke and actually the genealogy of his thought. It was very interesting to see this historical overview, though I think for students it might have been a bit too quick an introduction at some point. I think it could also be helpful to distribute your slides afterwards, and then especially the text on it also, that it's more readable, because it was hard, at least in this classroom, but maybe also on the screen at home or online, to read all of the text bullets you put into the slides. A really very interesting overview, I think, of Locke's thought. You may maybe stop sharing the screen now.
Yes, stop share.
Yes, okay, thank you.
I'm back.
Yeah, I guess that the audience can see me at home now at the screen, and you too in a doubled version, but that's what it is. So I invite now the audience to post question in the Q&A function. I don't see any questions right there, so maybe I'll start with a warming up question while people might ask questions, and maybe write on a sheet of paper and bring them to me, or just come here forward if you're in the classroom and present it. For example, Professor Reinhardt, we're in the class of Professor Reinhardt's course, and maybe as a political philosopher, he is keen on delivering some comments on your lecture or on asking you some questions. I don't know. I'm just inviting him to do so if you want. But my warming up question would be, we had a lecture, a webinar last week on Thomas Hobbes. We now had one on John Locke. What do you think of their, the comparison between the two thinkers? Where do they diverge? What are the common points of thinking? I'm especially thinking about their anthropology, maybe. Where you have Hobbes with his homo homini lupus dictum, whereas it seems that Locke has a slightly more optimistic view of man. So, but this is just a hunch. I leave it to you to make the comparison between these two political thinkers.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And of course, people who are well read in political philosophy would know, for example, that Leo Strauss, for example, endeavors to connect in some sense Hobbes and Locke together as sort of founders of sort of the moderns, right, in some sense. So I would act now, when I did my research at Oxford, right, I couldn't find any positive references to Hobbes in Locke's work. In fact, he calls him at one point that justly decried name. So he's clearly familiar with him, but not in a positive way. What I did find was a lot of references and notes about Hooker. One of the things, so your topic is the social contract, one of the things to look at would be precisely that, right? So if we look at, I think, both Locke and the Salamancans, we have an idea of human beings in natural association. That is, we could say something in nature drives us to associate with each other, right? So there's a natural communality, right, that exists. And to that degree, there is a point of agreement with the Aristotelian tradition, but we need a social contract to explain the political, specifically the form of government. If we look at Hobbes's social contract theory, it's sometimes called a pactum societatis. That is to say, a pact that creates society itself, right? In other words, the image that he has is, as the famous image of life nasty, brutish, and short, right? Individuals, everyone for themselves in this very violent world of atomic individualism. And to even explain basic human association, we need contract. So in that sense, Locke is a more radical contractarian, I think, than the tradition that I kind of outline. Another key element is something you, I think, just alluded to, which is the relative optimism, right? So Hobbes says at one point that where there's no law, that until there were laws, there was no injustice, laws being human creation. There is no natural moral law in the sense that Locke and Vittoria and Hooker would understand in the state of nature. That's all a product of human contrivance. So there's almost a kind of proto-secularism in Hobbes that I don't think you find, in the sense of it's all human. There's only positive law in some sense. There is natural law in Hobbes, I'm aware, in the sense of, say, the law of self-preservation, right? It's more like laws in an almost Darwinian sense, to my mind. So those are some of the differences. Locke clearly has much more, he speaks of the inconveniences of the state of nature, but not of absolute violence and chaos in the sense of Hobbes. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you for that and for sharing these thoughts with us. I see that the first question has arrived in the Q&A function. I think also in the chat, I'll check that later. But the one in the Q&A function is as follows. You seem to suggest you find on Vermeulen, you seem to suggest you find him a proponent of Hooker-Filmer. Is that right? And if so, would you elaborate? I find him difficult to take seriously as a critic of American political thought.
I'm not sure I fully understand. So Filmer, I would say Filmer and Hooker have contrary positions. So I'm not sure I fully, I don't see Locke as a follower of Filmer, obviously, because he's writing against it. But I see him as using Hooker to undermine Filmer's position. So I don't know if that gets at, I may have missed part of the question, so I don't know if that addresses it.
Let's go to the chat. A question on Vittoria. Since Vittoria has a dominion sui and Locke the idea of self as property, which is the key to his thought? Can we say De Vittoria and Locke agree on the most essential point of liberalism?
I think there is wide agreement in the sense that Vittoria, right, speaks of dominium sui, this fundamental power of rational self-mastery that all human beings have, in virtue of being created in God's image. They have this fundamental power over themselves, and because of God's grant of dominion over the earth, there's also dominium rerum in, we could say, the state of nature, right? So this idea of man's self-ownership in some sense, it's limited by natural law and other things, is fundamental to Vittoria's position in the course of staking out what is universal to all human beings, right? This idea of universal rights. Locke's view of property seems very similar, right? I mean, he says each of us have a property in ourselves, right? And we also have a right of property over the things of the earth that we acquire through our labor, right? So I think there is a lot of dovetailing between those two conceptions. I'm not sure quite, I'm not sure quite that Vittoria goes as far in terms of the individualism of Locke. There's more Thomism in his natural law theory, so there are clearly differences, but I do think we can see a commonality between the Salamancan tradition and the Lockean position.
Okay, there seem to be no more questions. I look now at the classroom here present. Are there any questions? And I think Professor Reinhardt will step forward and come to my chair and ask the question directly to you. Thank you for that. Meanwhile, I profit from the occasion to say that I really also liked the reference to the Jesuits' intellectual history. And especially I learned also that they were in fact fostering revolutionary thinking, and that maybe explains for their suspension in Europe in 1773. They were maybe too revolutionary. But now I leave the floor to Peter.
Do I need to take
No, you can just talk in front of the...
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture, which was very interesting, especially the links you made to the Salamanca school. But I have a question. It continues on linking Hobbes and Locke. You certainly know that to consider them founders of liberalism, of political liberalism, yes, but some also claim that they are the founders of economic liberalism, and that has to do with their theories of property, especially. I'm thinking of, you know that study, Macpherson's The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, yeah. Where he explains that both, but especially Locke, actually allows for this property accumulation because his provisos, which you mentioned, namely you have to labor land in order to call it your own, and you have to leave enough for others and good enough for others. But and Nozick also refers to that at a certain moment, because of the scarcity of land, this proviso is not respected anymore, and yet Locke doesn't seem to consider that to be a big problem, stating then that, well, if that happens, this individual acquisition of property is still legitimate as long as nobody is worse off than before. And for, you know, for Macpherson, this kind of so-called natural property rights allow for individual accumulation of property, which actually is a violation of the rights of others to acquire property. What do you think of that thesis?
Well, I mean, I think that on the one hand, I think that there's something to it in the sense that the Whig theory generally was very favored by the commercial classes. You know, if you study British history, of course, the commercial classes were the biggest promoters of liberalism, as we could argue that they are still today. I mean, and it's not surprising that a theory that emphasizes individual property rights and the right of individuals to invest and accumulate property, as I think is, as you remarking, implicit in what Locke said, would be attractive to the rising commercial classes, where of course the Tories were associated more with the landed aristocracy and so forth. By the way, there are some, including Friedrich Hayek, who trace liberalism, economic liberalism, further back to the Salamancans, in fact. There's a letter by Hayek in which he argues that the Jesuits were also the founders of economic liberalism. And of course, the Austrian school is one of the most important factors. Now, on the other hand, there's a Thomistic idea, right, that no one has the right to what they don't need when others lack necessities. And I think if you look at Locke's discussion of property and natural property, there was an element of that. It's in the slide where he says that you have a right to as much as you want until you deprive others, right? Yeah. So what you don't have a right to do is accumulate so much property that you take away the necessities that others need for their support. So I do think there is also a remnant element of that scholastic tradition in Locke's thought as well.
That's what Nozick calls this Lockean proviso, which is Okay.
So that implies that that Locke would have some criticism of Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or whatever. They can accumulate, but when the basic needs of so many other people are not fulfilled, then there is, of course, that moral obligation, I guess, towards these other people.
Now, of course, if we're looking at the modern economy, then we have to get into all kinds of discussions of, well, we're not talking about division of land anymore, but of like intellectual property rights and all sorts of complex questions that obviously Locke couldn't fully deal with. So obviously the liberalism, the forms of liberalism that exist today are highly adapted to the transformed economic circumstances.
Okay, one more question. You hinted at state of nature and that all men are equal, but what about slaves and slavery? You hinted at this issue with Bartolomeo de las Casas and so on. What does Locke tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's a very controversial element in Locke's history. He apparently owned stock in one of the Royal African companies that was involved in a slave trade. And he writes about slavery, arguing that it can be justified only in penal terms, right, as a punishment, right? Just as you can deprive people of life, you can deprive people of their liberty and essentially enslave them, or in the case of war, I suppose, like prisoners of war and this sort of thing. So I think that that's clearly a problem for Locke. There are people like Holly Brewer who have argued that Locke was essentially being paid in stock because he was doing committee work. It wasn't that he was particularly in favor of the slave trade. But I think we also have to recognize that Locke was a figure of his time, which was the 17th century. The abolitionist movements didn't really get going perhaps until the late 18th centuries, and was really in the 19th century that you start seeing. I mean, we can go from Aristotle down to Locke, and we won't find too much opposition to slavery. So I think we have to consider Locke in his circumstances, but consider it ultimately a problem for the liberal theory. And it's probably not surprising that liberal societies and Christian societies generally eventually found slavery to be incompatible with the conception of human dignity, the anthropology, as it were, that I sort of tried to outline, I guess.
So I know that you would not make Locke part of the cancel culture in the philosophical textbooks or whatever, or historical.
Which is another issue related to liberalism, right? Freedom of speech versus other values. Right? So.
Then there is a comment also in the Q&A. Today, why are defenders of human rights so anxious about the lack of a clear foundation for such rights? Why don't they just rely on Locke for the foundation of the rights? Okay.
Well, yeah, so I think here's a very fundamental question, a very fundamental issue. So as I outlined, I think that the philosophical and theological, right? Locke wrote a lot about the Bible, right? The theological underpinning of Locke's theory of human dignity has a strong religious basis, right? In the idea of human beings being created in God's image, right? Being in some sense transcendent over the rest of nature, right? There's human exceptionalism in some regards, right? There's a unique dignity of human beings, as well as I think classical rationalism, the idea of human beings as the rational animal, right? As we know from Aristotle. These were huge. We see that that's really the foundation in Vittoria, right? The Imago Dei is the foundation. Today, I think it's fair to say that the West is in the process or has been somewhat unmoored from those foundations, right? There's a weakening of Christianity. The classics are no longer studied in the way that they were once studied. So much of the foundations that provided the anthropology in which this notion of human dignity and rights arose is weakening. And then the question becomes, well, then what do we ground rights? Are they just human creations? Is it just something that we invent? Well, then what happens if another society or culture or regime decides to invent a different set of rights? If it's just the fiat of human will, there's a problem.
Right? The door is open for relativism, I guess.
The door is open for relativism. So relativism was not on the map in Locke's time or Vittoria's time, but it's very much on the map today as many of these foundations weaken.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that last comment again. It was very inspiring, your whole lecture and all your comments and answers to the questions. So it was a bit of a challenging evening here on the technical side also. I missed a bit at the beginning of your lecture because here in the classroom it was hard to transfer the sound and the image at the same time. But after all, Professor Reinhardt, who knows his classroom, he managed to do this. So thank you also to Professor Reinhardt for solving this issue here in the classroom. I hope that the people following this lecture online, they won't have noticed, I guess. So thanks again, and maybe if I may insist on sharing the slides and the text.
Yes,
so that people
where do I send
because
the slides?
We have students here who need to take this as exam mandatory reading, so that's why it's important to have this. And
no, I would be happy to. Maybe just let me know by email where I should send the slide.
Yes, we'll do that for sure.
Okay. And I'll be happy to share it with the participants.
Thanks a lot. I see also some gratitude popping up in the chat. So on behalf of all the audience online and here in the classroom, we can give you a big round of applause. I hope you can hear it. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And hope to see you again or to hear from you again.
I would be glad to revisit Belgium at some future point.
Yes, yes. Maybe you can do the inverse pilgrimage from Santiago de Compostela, because you're talking now from Santiago de Compostela, I learned, to Belgium. So we'll do that in summer, maybe.
Yes.
Okay. See you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.